So, today on the podcast, we're going to continue with Homer Brightman's memoir about his 15 years at Disney, from 1935 up through 1950. It's a career that encompasses the early short cartoons, the early features, the strike, the war, and then Walt's triumphant return to features with Cinderella. Homer Brightman wrote this memoir in the 1980s, long after leaving Disney and also after the passing of both Walt and Roy. And it is one of the clearest presentations of the Disney studio during the golden age of animation. In our last episode, we followed Homer as he first arrived at the Disney studio on Hyperion Avenue, and then after that we talked about a few things related to his account. Today we'll have the same structure. I'll read you Homer's memories preserved in his writing, and then I'll bring in one document that opens up this experience just a little more. The high point of today's episode, at least in my opinion, is Homer's presentation of Walt during a story meeting. Story development for film was one of Walt's strongest skills, and Homer does a fabulous job of capturing Walt's enthusiasm for and ability in a story meeting. And so with that, we're going to spin back the wheel of time to September 1935, again one of the latter years of the Great Depression, and follow Homer Brightman as he relates his experience in his own words. Chapter 2. During his lifetime, Walt was applauded for his music, his animation, his use of color and designs, his innovations, both in films and amusement parks, and his willingness to test new ideas. Yet those who knew him best and were closest to him regard Walt as a storyteller. He was at his best telling a story. He started with simple vignettes in Alice in Cartoonland, and then his stories became a trifle more complex in the early Mickey and Donald short subjects. His never-to-be-forgotten features, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Cinderella, were storytelling at its best. Even the rides at Disneyland, the best ones, have a sense of progression and involve the patron in a simple story. I got into my first story meeting with Walt by accident, and I'll never forget it. It took place on a hot morning in September 1935. By then, I had been working at the studio for a half year and had never seen Walt except that time in the men's room and brief glimpses of him in the halls and on the lot. At the time I accidentally encountered him, I was working on gags for a picture about broken dolls repairing themselves in clever ways in order to give an orphan child a surprise on Christmas morning. I had a couple of good ideas and decided it was time to bypass Hogsworth and see Sly. Walt's office was in an upstairs wing of the main building, and one morning about 8:30 I went up to see him, but he hadn't yet come in. Walking back down the carpeted hallway to the stairway, I passed the story room where a young fellow was seated in a chair studying a long storyboard filled with sketches. When I entered the room, he jumped to his feet and quickly turned the board to the wall in order to hide his story from me. Then, as if we had done nothing unusual, we shook hands and introduced ourselves. He was a short, ruddy-faced fellow with curly black hair, and his name was Pophoff. I knew well that all storymen striving for credit regarded fellow workers as potential thieves. Pophoff seemed nervous and anxious to get back to work. I left and he quickly shut the door. The door of a room nearby was open, and two large storyboards covered with sketches hung on the wall, one above the other. Animated cartoon stories were not written, but told with sketches, and the storyman had to explain his story after he had drawn it out for Walt. Evidently, a meeting was scheduled, for 2 rows of chairs had been placed in front of the boards. This was hallowed ground, and looking over a man's storyboards when he was absent was regarded as gag napping, a crime equivalent to cheating a blind widow. But what harm could I do? I entered the room, large and well-furnished except for the chairs. They looked like rejects from a WPA project. I scanned the boards quickly and saw the story was about mountain climbing. It opened with Mickey and Donald climbing a cliff tied together by a rope. The end of the rope was tied around the waist of Pluto the dog, leaving him dangling helplessly in space. Right off, I saw a little personality gag for Pluto, and decided to sketch it up, leave it on one of the chairs, and be gone before the meeting started. I took a sheet of animation paper from a stack on the desk behind me, and sitting down, became absorbed in my drawing. Suddenly a lean man, about 50, strolled into the room. He had a sun-dried face and curly white hair. He rolled a cigar around in his mouth and grinned at me, crow's feet crinkling away in long lines from the corners of his pale blue eyes. We introduced ourselves, and he said his name was Strayshott. Suddenly I remembered what I'd heard about him. He had a slow way of telling a story and was said to drag it out, chuckling all the time. He used to get Walt's goat, for Walt was an impatient man. By the time Strayshott had reached the second line of sketches on the first storyboard, Walt would be studying the last sketch on the last board. Strayshott had a funny style of drawing, and his room, it was said, connected to that of Sly. All gags submitted, except mine seemingly, landed on Sly's desk first. The rumor went around that Sly and Strayshott evaluated them together, and Strayshott would redraw the best gags in his funny style and pin them upon his storyboards for study. Walt dropped by Sly's office regularly, and Sly would steer him into Strayshott's adjoining room. Then Strayshott explained the gags and would get to laughing so hard he forgot to tell Walt whose gags they were, a natural oversight in the excitement of the moment. It was rumored that Walt's execs pounded the Three Musketeers theme into the artists. All for one and one for all, a happy family working for Walt in a great future. I was told that long before I came to the studio, the storymen had discovered things weren't just that way. They said Walt didn't give a damn whose gag it was as long as it improved the picture, and a spirit of secrecy had developed among the storymen. Generosity vanished, and gag-wise they became tighter than a gnat's ass. Strayshott asked me what I was doing, and I said I was working on gags for a Christmas picture about broken dolls, and had come up to see Mr. Sly, but he wasn't in. "Just leave him on his desk," Strayshott said. I thanked him and said I couldn't resist the open door, and glancing through the story saw a gag for the dog Pluto. Strayshott was about to look at it when a shattering cough was heard. He chuckled. That'll be Walt or Clem Longshanks. They've both got god-awful coughs." Just then a short, pot-bellied, middle-aged fellow walked in. His sparse brown hair was parted in the middle. He was apparently an old-timer in the business, and it didn't take long to tell he had bronchitis and bad. Several other fellows drifted in. I heard later one of them was Diddle. He smoked a pipe and asked in a relaxed manner, "Is this where the execution takes place?" He dropped into a chair, next to the yellow wicker chair. Then a thin, tall fellow strolled in. He had on a white shirt and a four-in-hand tie that seemed too short for him. He had a red face, a shoe-button nose, a long upper lip, and a receding chin. His black hair was combed straight back from a low forehead. His murky eyes coasted around the room, taking me in, and I noticed they were empty, devoid of any feeling. He was greeted with, "Hi, Si." So that was Sly, and I was seeing him for the first time. I started to leave the room when a smiling young girl breezed in, carrying a steno machine. I stepped aside for her just as Walt charged through the door. He brushed past me and slumped into the wicker chair, amidst a chorus of, "Good morning, Walt." He ignored the greetings. Eyebrows arched, he was glancing around abruptly and shot a glance at me as if to say, "Who the hell are you?" Then he turned back to the storyboards. Apparently he took in everything. Once again I was struck by his resemblance to a Spaniard. He had a high-bridged nose, a small black mustache, and thick, straight, dark hair. But I knew by now that he was of Scottish-Irish descent. He wore dark slacks and a dark blue short-sleeved jersey with narrow horizontal stripes of a lighter blue. Although he was slightly built and of medium height, he was large-boned with the physique of a guy who lifted weights. His forearms were muscular, and he had big, bony hands with long, sturdy fingers, and those fingers were never still during the meeting, plucking at loose pieces of wicker or drumming impatiently on the arm of the chair. He glanced around the group and said, "All right, Clem, let's get on with it." Longshanks wheezed out a bronchial blast and pointed to the first drawing with a wooden pointer. He began describing the actions of Mickey and Donald climbing the mountain. Suddenly, Walt interrupted. "We want a little fast music to begin with, and a blend of yodeling from Mickey and the Duck." "Good, Walt," said Longshanks. He had barely resumed when Walt cut in again. "Every time they drive their picks into the mountain, they should do a leapfrog effect, like a spring, and yodel right after it." Right." Longshanks had reached the third sketch. Walt frowned. "What about Pluto?" he said. "He's got to do something. He can't hang around like a sack of potatoes." A thoughtful silence fell over the room. This was one of the most important moments of my life. An idea popped into my mind. I was still making only $15 a week. Some of the fellows had told me that the only way to get ahead was to impress Walt personally. Here he was, and now was my chance to do it. Nobody here was going to do it for me. I listened to my voice break the silence, as if it was the voice of a stranger. What if a little bush grows on the side of the cliff and Pluto tries to sniff it but gets yanked away? Walt came to life. He swung around to face me. "That's good," he said. I felt like I'd won the sweepstakes. A lot of grim smiles surrounded me, but I ignored them and resolved to come up with anything else that seemed funny. "We can use this gag a couple of times," Walt was saying. "Every time Pluto tries to sniff a bush or a tree, he gets yanked up, he's helpless." Sly said, "We can use it for a running gag." Walt was talking directly to me. "That's good dog personality stuff. That's the type of gag we need around here." Then he looked back at the boards, and I glanced at Sly. He was Snow White under the eyes. I began to sweat. Meanwhile, Longshanks went on with his story. "Mickey is up first, and he pulls up the duck. Then both of them pull Pluto up, and the duck ties Pluto to a boulder." Then I interrupted him. Could Pluto look back over the edge of the cliff and make a frightened take? He backs up and puts his paws over his eyes." Walt laughed for the first time. "He's frightened. He cringes." Longshanks said the duck had gone off to pick edelweiss, while Mickey hunted for eagle eggs. He had a lot of stuff drawn up for Walt to shoot at, but Walt ignored the storyboards. He turned to the group and, without hesitating, went through a non-stop funny routine. I was impressed. He was a hell of a gag man. He jumped to his feet and went on like this. Mickey starts by picking up eagle eggs in excitement. He's real happy. Then a dark shadow comes into the scene. Mickey looks up and sees the mother eagle sitting atop a boulder watching him. Mickey gives an embarrassed chuckle and starts putting the eggs back in the nest one at a time. All the time he keeps an eye on the mother eagle. She watches him with a fierce expression. He puts the last egg into the nest, but drops it. A little eagle pops up. Mickey tries to pat it. "A nice little guy," he says, but the eagle nips his finger. Mickey lets out a yell, and the mother eagle zooms down at him. He fires eagle eggs at her, and as he throws them, they pop open and little eagles come sailing out. They attack Mickey. He covers his head and shoves them into Pluto's scene. All the time, the old girl is on the rock. She's urging the little eagles on. Pluto comes to Mickey's aid, running around the boulder with the rock he's tied to bouncing along behind him. Then Walt fell silent and slumped back into his chair. He fished in his pocket and pulled out a crumpled pack of Lucky Strikes. Diddle, seated beside him, held a match while the rest of the men were saying, "That's great, Walt. Funny stuff." Everything he said was fresh and funny and in continuity. That was the marvel of it. I knew then he wasn't Walt Disney for nothing. He seemed to be talking to himself. "What do we do with the duck?" "The duck's collecting flowers and singing," said Longshanks. "He can't just pick flowers. I want him to do something funny," said Walt impatiently. I had it. He's got a bunch of Edelweiss. Just as he holds it up to admire it, a little mountain goat pops up from behind a rock and chomps the flowers off, leaving the surprised duck holding the stems. He gets madder than hell," cried Walt. Everybody began tossing out gag ideas, and we developed a lot of back and forth stuff between the little goat and the angry duck. Walt got hot again. Another little goat joins the first little goat, and they come at the duck from different directions and try to butt him. He picks up a rock and holds it between them, and they butt it. The duck laughs, and then he finds he's facing the old man goat. Walt stopped again. The old goat butts the duck up the side of a cliff. "He's KO'd, suggests Longshanks. "We come back to him later." He ended with a wheezy cough. "I wish we had something better than that," said Walt. I was so excited about being in a story meeting with Walt that I was thinking myself crazy. I stood up without realizing it. The old man goat bucks the duck up the hill. He slides down and gets butted up again. Longshanks interrupted me. "What's so funny about that?" "Wait a minute. I'm not finished," I cried. "After getting butted up the hill a couple of times, the duck loses his temper and butts the old man goat." "Too corny," said Sly. Walt swung around to face him. "Corny? What's corny about it?" he cried. "The duck's got a hell of a temper, hasn't he?" So he turns around and runs straight at the old man goat, who comes straight at him. We cut back and forth like two trains coming together, and blam, the old goat flies out of the scene and lands flat on his back, dizzy as hell. Everybody cracked up, but Walt scowled. Maybe we're getting too straight around here. Maybe we need to go a little farther." I could feel everybody in the room tighten. I looked at my watch, 11:45. The group seemed restless and tired, but Walt was just getting steamed up. He was able to do the whole story by himself. He didn't need any help, just a couple of cigar store Indians to bounce his stuff off of. He described everything clearly, as if it had taken place on a picture screen in his mind. With everybody itching to go to lunch, Walt was hot. "We go back to Pluto, chasing the little eagle," he said. "The rock he's tied to bouncing along behind him, the eagle flies off the edge of the cliff, and Pluto saves himself by grabbing a bush with his teeth. The big rock he's tied to bounces past him and goes over the edge and yanks Pluto after it. He bounces from ledge to ledge, and the rock lands first at the bottom in the snow. Pluto bongs into it and is knocked out cold." Cut to a little doghouse with a Red Cross flag flying from the top. A big St. Bernard sticks his head out and comes over to Pluto, half buried in the snow, and pulls him out by the tail. Pluto's stiff and blue with the cold. He clatters around like a plate on the ice. The St. Bernard turns the spigot On his brandy keg with his mouth, he's very matter-of-fact about it. Walt went on in a rush, his eyes vacant, as if he actually saw the picture animating before him, and he was simply describing what he saw. He told how Pluto changed color after swallowing the liquor. A series of red circles formed on his blue stomach and got bigger and bigger until Pluto was his own color again. Then Pluto became drunk. I suggested, he licks the St. Bernard's jowls. Yes, Walt said, the St. Bernard is very dignified. He turns his head away disgusted. He can't stand the fumes. We cut back to Mickey, the duck, and the eagles. Walt fell back into his chair and finished another cigarette. Again Diddle held a match for him. Walt took a long drag, followed by a hollow cough. We don't have to bring them all back together again, he said, becoming thoughtful. They could finish their individual pieces of business, and we could end on Pluto and the St. Bernard. I said, what if Mickey and the duck were chased off the cliff by the eagles and fall down through the roof of the St. Bernard's house? That will tie them all together, exclaimed Walt. They come up out of the wrecked roof and look off stage and hear singing. We cut to the dogs at the end. They're both drunk, howling and yodeling together. Sly thought Sweet Adeline would be appropriate. Walt frowned at him. No, let's get something more in keeping with this type of picture. At the end, both dogs lean together for a long chord. Get Barker to do the dog voices. The St. Bernard should have a deep bass voice and Pluto a high one. After Barker does both voices, we'll dub them together. Then Walt went back over the whole story from beginning to end, never hesitating, adding new things as he went along. His mind seemed to be a kaleidoscope of ideas, forever changing, sending new images to him. I think his mind was something he couldn't turn off if he had wanted to. A hard driver, not very interested perhaps in the ones being driven, only interested in improving the stories. Walt stood up. I looked at my watch again. This time it was 10 after 1 o'clock. You've got a bunch of stuff here now, Clem, he said. Let's get busy and tie it up. Build that duck stuff. Show him always starting things. I want Mickey to get going with that eagle business before we cut to the duck. While Walt was talking, Strayshott suggested Pluto's nose flashing on and off like a light globe. I would like to see the whites of their eyes show red, added Sly. Let's have a final meeting next week, said Walt, and strode out of the room. Have you got it all down? Longshanks asked the secretary. I think so, she said. When can I get the notes? This afternoon. Longshanks stared forlornly at his storyboards. He groaned, Christ, I'll have to redraw the son of a bitchin' thing all over again. How about a sketchman to help? Strayshott can give you a lift, suggested Sly. Longshanks reacted as if he had been stabbed. No, thanks just the same, Si. I'll slug it out myself. Clem Longshanks didn't want Strayshott's funny sketches covering his storyboards. He knew from long experience that by next week Walt would have forgotten whose gags were whose, and Strayshott would get the credit. I remembered again hearing it said that all Walt cared about was the final result. Strayshott and Sly were leaving for lunch, and I caught up with them. You had a good idea in the meeting, Homer, said Strayshott between puffs on his cigar. I thanked him and asked Mr. Sly if I could show him my broken doll gags after lunch. His face was expressionless. No need to, he said. Just keep turning them into Hogsworth. When he gets a big enough batch, he brings them up to me. He was an old smoothie. Okay, I replied, and watched the two of them go down the stairs together. It would be a long Siberian winter before I got into another meeting with Walt. Nevertheless, I was elated. I had made an impression on him, and something was bound to happen. It did. That afternoon I was called into Hogworth's office. With his usual superior manner, he said, We're raising you to $25 a week. In Walt's cast of characters, None was more popular than Donald Duck. I think he appeared first in The Wise Little Hen, but I thought his second picture, Orphan's Benefit, was a lot funnier. In this one, the duck strode onto the stage, and Mickey announced he would recite Little Boy Blue. When he came to "Come blow your horn," a crowd of Mickey's orphans in the gallery gave him the raspberry. Every time he tried to repeat the poem, he was hooted and jeered by the crowd, and losing his temper, wanted to fight everybody. A long cane with a hook on the end of it zipped out from the wings and yanked him off stage. The duck, animated by Grout, was an immediate hit with the public, and Donald Duck was the name decided upon by Walt. He immediately began a search for a suitable voice. One day he heard of a young fellow who drove a little milk wagon drawn by Shetland ponies, and who visited schools where he gave imitations of animal voices and bird calls. Walt had him in for an audition and discovered the voice of Donald Duck. The duck became so popular, Walt signed with King Features to feature him in a daily newspaper comic strip. I was given the task of doing the gags, and an artist drew the finished strip. It caught on, but I was unhappy because I wanted to work in the story department. Walt heard about it and agreed to transfer me back if I could train someone to take my place. And happily, a very good prospect turned up. We worked together, and soon he was able to take over gags for the strip, and I was back on pictures. While working in the bungalow on comic strip gags, I became acquainted with a middle-aged, silent, gloomy Englishman who inked the Good Housekeeping page and who also inked the Mickey Mouse comic strip. I thought of him as a Gloomy Gus. He brought his lunch every day and always ate a small can of Libby's fruit cocktail for dessert. Day after day it was fruit cocktail. The fellows couldn't let this go on, and managed to get the can of fruit cocktail and fix the label to another can of a Libby product so that when Gloomy Gus opened his can of fruit cocktail, it would contain succotash, green beans, hash, anything but fruit cocktail. The fellow was amazed and told everybody about the mistake Libby had made, and it was suggested to him to go across the street to the market where he was a steady customer and threatened to sue both the market and Libby's for the mistake. The market manager was in on the gag and promised to take it up with Libby's at once. But Gloomy finally caught on, and to him there was nothing bloody well funny about it. A couple of months later he left Disney for greener fields, if there were any at that time. After returning to the story department, I attended meetings in projection room number 4, where Walt was reviewing a partially animated cartoon. Lynx, one of the best directors in the studio, was directing the picture, and Walt, who didn't like the stuff, was chewing him out. The room was in complete darkness. Suddenly a girl with a decided Texas drawl spoke up. "Y'all can't talk that way to him." Walt shouted, "Lights!" then turned around and bellowed, "Who said that?" "I did, you old meanie," said a pretty girl with a Texas drawl. "Who are you anyway?" demanded Walt, "and what's your name?" "I'm Mr. Link's secretary," said the girl. Walt's eyebrows met in a menacing arc. "I don't think you're in a position that calls for comments of any kind when I'm reviewing a picture. Let's get on with the damn thing." The room went black again, and the rough picture appeared on the screen. Link's secretary's return to Texas was not overly long delayed. In closing up, again, I want to briefly take a look at one more thing relating to the stories in today's episode. I have at least some of the typed up notes related to this story meeting, and Homer's memory is really accurate, or perhaps he also saved the meeting notes from this day for decades until he wrote this chapter. Homer describes the meeting as taking place on a warm September morning, and it took place on Tuesday, September 17th, 1935, and it was supposed to end at noon just as he describes. The stenotypist in the room, likely after the meeting ended, combined up all the ideas into an overview narrative of what was discussed, and the summary in Homer's chapter matches very closely what was typed up. For example, about the early part of the cartoon, the stenotypist wrote, "When Mickey and the Duck drive their picks into the mountain, they should get a sort of leapfrog effect, a sort of spring. In the moment after the spring, they both yodel and say, 'Pull!'" Though some other story meeting notes from this period have more individual quotes from the attendees, this particular story meeting overview mostly focuses on the things that Walt said in terms of preserving individual ideas. At one point, the document describes that Walt, and here I'll quote again from the document, suggests the idea of two goats going for the duck. Duck could grab a rock and hold it between them, and they would get the bump. But the one aspect I most want to point out from this document is how the attendees at this meeting are listed in terms of name. Most of the attendees at this meeting are from the story department, and mostly the document lists them by first name, such as Walt, Ted, Harry, George, Webb, and so on. But Homer is listed by his last name. He's listed simply as Brightman, which suggests that the person typing up these notes likely didn't know Homer and perhaps only caught his last name. This also shows Homer as someone who is still working his way into the culture of the studio. When this meeting took place, the cartoon had the working title of Mountain Climbing, but was eventually released under the title Alpine Climbers. Unlike the cartoon we talked about last week, Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod, which took a few years to finalize, Alpine Climbers came out about 10 months after this particular story meeting. It's not on Disney+, but if you Google Disney's Alpine Climbers, I'm sure you can find it somewhere online. I'll be back next week with a new episode. And one more thing before you go. If you've been enjoying this podcast on Apple or Spotify or one of the many other public feeds, we would love to have you join us as a subscriber over on Bandcamp. On Apple and the other public outlets, you will find 100 episodes. But over on Bandcamp, you'll find over 400, including mini albums that collect up our longer series into multi-hour presentations. The best reason, however, to become a monthly subscriber is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast can continue to exist. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast, so Bandcamp supporters are the people who keep this whole enterprise going. Their contributions ensure that research continues towards our more in-depth topics and that our conversations remain independent outside of any sponsor-related influence. You can support us by becoming a subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes today. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.